Okay, so that is the recording in progress, funnily enough. Um, so, welcome again. It's great to be here. It's great to have two speakers who I think are going to tell us some really interesting stuff about moths and about land use change. Both our speakers are joining us from Scotland tonight. But both of the topics that they're going to present are highly appropriate to Devon, a county that has an awful lot of livestock farming, and a county that has uplands, Dartmoor obviously, and a bit of Exmoor as well. So I think it'll be a really interesting. So we'll have the first talk, then there'll be some time for questions if people have questions, and then we'll have the second talk and then questions about that one. I would encourage you to put your questions in the chat. So if you're not aware of the chat, when you go to the sort of bottom of the screen, you should find a little chat button. And if you click on that, you'll get a box at the side of the screen will open up, and you can put messages in there. You'll see we've already got a couple of messages in there. Hello from Worcestershire. Hello from Worcestershire. Really glad you could join us. So yes, if you have questions for the speakers, please write them in the chat. And that means obviously you can put the questions down as you go along while you're thinking of them. If someone's, said something in one of the talks and you think, oh, yeah, I want to come back to that, then just type the question down at the time. And at the end of the talk, I will look through the chat and put any questions that have come up to the speakers. Anyway, you didn't join to hear me rambling on, so we will get on with the first talk. And I'm really happy, delighted to welcome Rochelle Kennedy from Scotland's Rural College up in Aberdeen. And Rochelle's a final year PhD researcher who's going to talk to us about moths and agriculture or livestock farming. So, Rochelle, would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, will do. Thank you for the introduction. Just share that now. Hey, you see that okay?
It's coming. Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, so I've been doing a PhD looking at how different types of farming impact on moths as well as other things. And today I'm going to talk to you about a particular project that I've done on how regenerative grazing might benefit moths. So when it comes to talking about the environment and biodiversity, cows often get a lot of bad press. So we know that they are responsible for significant amounts of methane emissions, which contribute to climate change. But also we have a problem in the UK with overgrazing, which has detrimental impacts on biodiversity and on grassland insects in particular. However, cattle or any grazing livestock do play an important role in maintaining biodiversity in grassland systems. So we know that grazing can help to reduce competitive plant species, which in turn increases the diversity of plants in the pasture, which obviously can then help insect diversity. And then having livestock grazing can also introduce natural nutrient input, which kind of reduces the need for things like synthetic fertilizers, which are often used by farmers to kind of increase grass growth. And we know these synthetic fertilizers are detrimental to plant diversity and insects. And then finally, there is some research to show that grazing cattle can help to increase diversity in the seed bank through kind of spreading seeds via dung. So there's a few different ways that cattle are actually beneficial for pasture diversity. So if we think about wild cows, how they would behave in the wild, we might often think about these like really big herds of buffalo or wildebeest. Not so much in the UK, but in like on the continent. And so in these natural sort of wild systems, these cattle would stay in really big numbers, so hundreds to thousands of individuals in a herd. And because of the pressure from predators, they'll often stay really quite compact. So you can imagine that this would put quite a lot of pressure on the grassland, from trampling and from grazing. But the thing is with these wild systems that these massive herds are kept constantly on the move because of that pressure from predators, but also the search for water. And so although there is a lot of grazing and trampling pressure in one area, it is not there for very long. And then so they'll move on quite quickly to a different area. And then quite often it will be quite some time before they come back round to that same grassland. And so it gives the grass a much longer recovery period. So this is very different to how we keep cattle in the UK. So we mostly see what we call set stock systems, which is where we keep cows in much smaller numbers than we would see in the wild. And they're kept in fields for several weeks at a time, sometimes for the whole grazing season, which up here is sort of from April or May until October. And the problem with that is that it tends to lead to overgrazing, which I mentioned, I think, in the second slide, which means that the grass becomes very, very short, the soil becomes compacted, and we get areas of bare ground. And you can imagine that for any insects that are trying to survive in this environment, it might be quite tricky. So there's been a lot of interest, I would say a lot of excitement actually within the farming community about regenerative grazing, or farmers tend to call it mob grazing. And this is where cattle are kept in higher numbers than usual, but they're kept in quite small paddocks and then moved on a daily basis. So it's kind of defined as this short duration, high density grazing. And then farmers also aim to have a longer than usual recovery period for the grass. And so it leads to what we can see here, which is like a mosaic of different areas within the same field that are at different recovery stages. So you can see here, this has obviously just been grazed, and the cattle have been moved down to this corner. And then there's other areas of the field where the grass is still quite long. So yeah, it's a lot of hype about regenerative grazing, and there are a lot of claims out there that this regenerative grazing or mob grazing can increase or help biodiversity. So I've just put a few quotes here from some of the sort of farming magazines and websites. So the Scottish farmer here saying mob grazing boosts biodiversity and saves money. Sounds great. And then other claims that, farmers are choosing to mob graze because of the benefits to soil health and biodiversity. And also the NFU saying that, again, mob grazing is beneficial to wild flora and fauna. So yeah, lots of ideas that mob grazing could increase biodiversity. However, when we actually look at the science, there's very little evidence to suggest that it does increase biodiversity. And for insects in particular, there's been just a handful of papers. And then if we then look at moths, there's pretty much been nothing done at all. So we don't know whether this system is beneficial for moths or not. So I set out to try and answer this question: is mob grazing beneficial for moths in comparison to the more traditional, set stocked grazing? So there's a number of different ways through which it could benefit moths. So we have a lot of species of moth that feed on grasses in their larval form. And so you can imagine that maybe those longer pasture rest periods might lead to like taller grass or more food for the larvae. But also those longer rest periods are going to potentially reduce the kind of disturbance from the cattle. But at the same time, we might imagine that those large numbers of cattle in a small area, there's potential there for there to be quite a lot of destruction when they are in the field. So it's unclear, whether it would be beneficial for moths or not. So I set out to find as many farms as I could that were practicing this regenerative grazing. And because I'm based up in Aberdeen, this study was kind of focused up in Scotland. Although you can see, so the purple dots show the farms that I found that were practicing mob grazing. You can see they're quite kind of scattered across Scotland. So I ended up finding 13 of these. And then what I did was pair them with a nearby set stocked field or farm. So that's where the cattle are being kept in the field for several weeks rather than being moved daily. And so I went to these pairs of farms and carried out caterpillar surveys between March and June in 2023, actually, this is not 2022. And then went back in the summer and looked and did adult moth surveys with light trapping between July and August. And we also carried out some plant surveys. So you might wonder how you go about looking for caterpillars if you haven't already done it yourselves, and how you go about finding caterpillars in a huge field of grass. It might be a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. But the fun thing about grass or some grassland caterpillar species is that although during the day they will hide either underground or in the leaf litter, after dark they'll actually crawl up the blades of grass to feed at the tips of the stems. And so that means that we can come along with a sweep net and just walk a transect, sweeping the net from side to side and catching caterpillars as we go. And then hopefully that leads to a really good catch. You can see here lots of little juicy caterpillars in there, as well as lots of other little bugs. In reality, the catch wasn't often this good. There were lots of transects and lots of entire fields actually where we caught very low numbers of caterpillars, sometimes no caterpillars. So we did end up having to go back to some of these sites more than once to get enough data for this project. And the other problem that we came across with it being sort of North Scotland in March was terrible weather. So we had really bad weather in the spring of 2023 and lots of snow and freezing temperatures. And so the grass was not as tall as I thought it was going to be at some of the sites we went to. So we'd get to the site with the sweep net and realise, so be faced with this and realise, well, okay, I'm not going to have to sweep net this. That's just not going to happen. So kind of had to improvise a little bit. And so when we got to a field where we couldn't sweep net, we carried out some manual searches with a torch. So we set up 5 quadrats, so 1 meter quadrats, sort of randomly across the field. And then we did like timed 3-minute searches with a torch. And we were able to find caterpillars in this way, even when the fields were like severely overgrazed. We did find the odd caterpillar. So once I'd collected all these caterpillars, I had the really fun task of trying to identify them. Now, I was definitely not an expert in caterpillar ID back then. I think I'm probably slightly better at it now. So to me, these are all different species, but they all kind of look very similar. They're just, brown with stripes. And some of them are really small as well. So some of them were less than 5 millimeters long. And so when they're that small, it's really, impossible to identify them to species. So what I did was I ended up keeping quite a lot of these caterpillars in my shed in these little raising pots. So there was like a hole at the top with mesh covering it so the air could circulate so it didn't get too damp inside the pots. And then a bit of tissue paper at the bottom just to soak up any moisture from the plants. And so I kept them like this until either they were big enough to be able to identify. So it's, some of them, when they got bigger, I could identify them and then release them into suitable habitat. And then others I had to wait until they had pupated and then emerged as adults to be able to identify the adult moth. So one of the challenges that I had in particular with raising the caterpillars was trying to figure out what they eat. So I had lots of species where I didn't actually know what species they were. So it was a bit of trial and error. I had a very helpful suggestion from someone very knowledgeable to try giving them slices of carrot, which is what this orange thing is. And it turns out that actually a lot of them were quite happy just eating carrot. So that was great. But for the ones that wouldn't eat the carrot, it was a bit of trial and error trying to try different grass species and plant species to see what they would eat. So it's just an example of one of the caterpillars that pupated. So it sort of made this cocoon in a silk case in the grass that was in the pot. And then emerged as a smoky wainscot. So whilst I was raising all these caterpillars and hoping that they would pupate and survive, I then went back to the same farms and did some light trapping. So I used these homemade UV LED light traps. It's just a UV LED light strip that's sort of wrapped around a tube and connected to a solar sensor. So it comes on at dusk and goes off at dawn. And I decided to place these traps in the middle of the fields to try and avoid catching moths that were maybe more interested in using the hedgerows next to the fields. And then I did this once on each farm. So just to give you an overview of the sorts of numbers that we found from this project. So for caterpillars, we caught 234 individuals and identified 18 different species. All of the species that we caught were grass feeders, except one individual that we found just sort of clinging to a twig in one of the manual quadrat searches. I think probably it just got blown there from a nearby woodland and probably didn't really want to be there. All of these were macromoths except two species that were butterfly species. And then for the adult moths, we caught pretty much twice as many as caterpillars. And around 20% of these were micromoths. We identified a lot more species than for caterpillars, so 61 species. However, half of these species that we found were actually considered like woody plant feeders in their larval form, so probably hadn't come from the pasture. Although this only made up about 20% of the total abundance of moths. I thought I'd just give you an idea of the caterpillar species that we found using the two different methods as well. It's quite interesting. So here on the left, we can see the species that were found using the manual quadrat searches. So they were only found in quadrats. And on the right, the species that were only found in sweep netting And then in the middle, the ones that were found using both methods. So you can see there is a bit of a difference in the species between the two methods, even though there is a bit of overlap. Having said that, we didn't have enough data really to, statistically test whether the communities that we found in sweep netting were different to the communities found in pod rats. So it is anecdotal, but still interesting, I think. So I'm going to show you the results that we found for caterpillars. So looking at whether mob grazing was beneficial in comparison to set stocked grazing. So these box plots on the left show caterpillar abundance in mob grazed fields, which is the green box plot, and in set stock fields, which is the grey. And on the right, you can see caterpillar species richness, again in mob grazed fields in green, and set stock fields is just this line here. So we can see straight away that both abundance and species richness was higher in the mob grazed fields compared to the set stock fields. And this was a significant difference. Now, so this is actually, I should say, this is quite an exciting thing to be able to tell the farmers actually that are doing these regenerative grazing practices, because they're trying quite hard to make a living, but also they're trying to benefit nature and biodiversity on their farm. So it was quite rewarding to be able to go back to them and show them what we found. So this is for caterpillars. And then if we look at the data from the moth trapping, so the light traps, it's a bit of a different story. So here we've got moth abundance on the left, species richness in the middle, and moth diversity index on the right. And we can see already that there's not that much difference between the two grazing treatments, and there's quite a lot of variation. And then when we tested this statistically, there was actually no significant difference found for any of these. And even when we had a go at sort of subsetting the moths just to look at species that feed on grass in their larval form, but we still found no differences there. And when we subsetted to just look at micromoths, again, no differences. So I think, probably this is just due to moths being so much more mobile in their adult form than they are in their larval form. So, there may be benefits of caterpillar sampling if you're looking at like field scale management practices. And so as part of this project, I also took the opportunity to just have a look at other pasture characteristics. So in terms of both management and vegetation composition, because farmers do lots of things differently. And so there's potentially a lot going on in these fields. And so for vegetation characteristics, we wanted to look at how, pasture composition might benefit moths and caterpillars. And so we looked at the percentage cover of ryegrass, which seemingly seemed to be like the most important factor, or the kind of the biggest influence on moths and caterpillars. Now, ryegrass is a species that farmers grow, abundantly because it's good for their livestock, for fattening the livestock. But it does require quite high fertilizer input. So there's a potential there for it to be detrimental to moths or caterpillars. And so we did find that as the percentage cover of ryegrass increased, we had a decrease in moth abundance, caterpillar abundance, and caterpillar species richness. So that was quite interesting. The other thing that we looked at in terms of like pasture structure was vegetation height, which was actually statistically higher in mob grazed fields than it was in set stock fields. So it was a characteristic of mob grazing was to have taller vegetation when we went and measured it in the spring. However, we didn't find any effect of vegetation height on moths or caterpillars. And I do wonder if perhaps if we had measured the vegetation in the summer, like in the previous summer, prior to sampling in the spring, whether that might have had some kind of influence, having taller vegetation at the time the eggs were being laid. But we weren't able to look at that this time. And then just finally, in terms of pasture management, I thought it was important to kind of look at the length of time that the field had had to recover since the last time the cattle were in there. And we found that this kind of time since last grazed, as that increased, we found higher caterpillar abundance and species richness. So the longer the field had had to rest, the more caterpillars and the more caterpillar species there were. However, when we looked at actually the number of rest days per year, which is much higher in mob graze systems, obviously because they're trying to extend that rest time, we found no effect here. And then lastly, some of the farms, as well as mob grazing cattle, did have sheep. Some of them didn't have sheep. So we felt that was important to include that. And I guess unsurprisingly, found a negative effect of the presence of sheep on caterpillar abundance, species richness, and moth abundance. And it could be because sheep graze differently to cattle. When you see a sheep graze field, the grass is often really, really short. They seem to just nibble right down to the ground. So it could be that, or it could just be that it's an additional grazing pressure, on top of the cattle being there. It's just, a higher sort of stocking rate having the sheep as well. Okay, so just to try and summarize all of that, we found that mob grazing increased caterpillar abundance and species richness compared with set stocking, which is really exciting because it's the first time that this has been done for moths, as far as I'm aware. But these differences didn't seem to relate to some of the other things that we looked at. So things like the longer yearly pasture rest period or vegetation height. So it was seemingly nothing to do with that. So we haven't been able to unpick, why mob grazing or regenerative grazing was beneficial. My feeling is that it could even be that, farmers that are practicing regenerative grazing might also be practicing other biodiversity friendly things alongside that. Maybe they're reducing the amount of wormer they're using, and things like that. But we don't know at this point. And then we also found that other pasture management practices were important. So things like vegetation composition, that negative effect of ryegrass, and also the negative effect of presence of sheep. So I think moving forwards, if farmers are wanting to practice regenerative grazing with cattle, they may want to consider whether grazing sheep over the winter months might negate some of that positive effect on biodiversity. And then we saw some quite interesting things with regards to the different methods used. So we saw that the method choice might influence outcomes, particularly when we're comparing sort of light trapping with larval sampling. And it might be that if we're wanting to look at the effect of some sort of small scale practice, so like field scale management practices, that may be larval sampling, even though it is a lot more intensive on the surveyors, might actually be better at kind of teasing out those effects. And then finally, just to say that there are obviously some limitations, as always, to this study. So, we only sampled external feeding caterpillars. So the caterpillars that feed are like at the top of the grass. There are lots of species that feed inside the grass or underground, which we didn't sample for. And also we did our sampling at a very specific time of year. So, maybe if we sampled for species that were around at a different time of year in their larval form, we might find different results. And then because mob grazing is quite a new thing up here, the farmers that we had not been mob grazing for that long. So they've been doing this for between 1 and 10 years, with an average of about 5 years. So when we think about the effects of grazing on plants in particular, that's not very long. So it would definitely be interesting to kind of try and follow the effect of mob grazing over time in future. So thank you very much for listening. I just want to say thank you to a couple of people that gave me invaluable information on how to raise caterpillars, so Mark Gill and Roy Neverton. And also to Charlotte Wood for helping me with field work and spending hours and hours in the dark and the cold looking for caterpillars. And also to Butterfly Conservation and the Diarcia Fund, as well as Scotland's Rural College for joint funding the project. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Rochelle. That was really interesting. So everyone, just a reminder, or if you weren't here right at the start, please put any questions in the chat if you can. That would be great. It would just be a lot easier, I think, than trying to get people to chip in directly. So I'll kick that off while people are typing, hopefully. So you kind of partly addressed the kind of question I was going to raise, Rochelle, with your last point about the duration. So yeah, I was going to ask about how long these sampled fields had been in mob grazing, and you've answered that, but were you able to kind of include that in the analysis then to see if there was any difference between the moth communities in fields that had been mob grazed for longer, or was there just not enough data to do that at the moment?
Probably, yeah. I guess there's so many things we could have looked at, but I think there's probably not enough data to be able to, include everything. So we really had to be quite stringent with choosing what we wanted to look at. It is possible, yeah, that the farms that have been mob grazing for longer. I mean, just off the top of my head, the two farms where we found the kind of highest number of species were the ones that have been doing it for the longest. But I think we need more data and more spread of like number of years.
Yeah. Okay, great. Right. Questions are piling in now. I knew there would be. Just needed to give people a moment. So let me go back up to the start of the chat so we get people in the right order. So Matt asks, is there evidence that wild cattle existed in the UK in comparable herd sizes to those seen in the Americas and Africa?
I don't know. I could imagine they're probably not such big herd sizes. And yeah, it is obviously a very different system. And this idea of mob grazing has come from America. And so a lot of the research that has been done in North America, and quite often in quite sort of arid areas and very, very different systems to the UK. Yeah, it is different.
But nevertheless, your findings are very interesting. Nick asks, you suggested that higher abundance might be to do with other factors than that like the farmers were sort of sympathetic to. Did you get any anecdotal sense of what those sort of things might be?
Not really. I mean, I wondered whether it might be due to worming or lack of worming, but we did ask sort of after the study, we did go back and ask farmers whether they were worming, and some of the mob grazing farmers were still using wormer. Some of the set stock farmers were not.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. But yeah, no real idea of why it might be. Yeah,
Well,
unfortunately.
there's always scope for more data gathering and more analysis, isn't there?
Definitely.
That's just science, yeah.
Yeah.
So Rob Walton says, most interesting. Thank you, Rochelle. Did you keep the bycatch in the moth traps, especially diptera flies? Changes in crane fly abundance and species richness might have been particularly revealing.
Hmm.
It's no secret that Rob's quite keen on flies as well as moths.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and a good point. I did not keep the bycatch. There were times where I was actually getting eaten alive by midges when I was trying to ID the moths in the traps. So my eyes were covered in midges. So yeah, I just kind of focused on IDing the moths that were there and just let the crane flies and the midges and everything else go. But it would definitely be interesting to look at other insects. And actually, from the sweep netting, I'm kind of a little bit annoyed at myself actually. I didn't keep bycatch from the sweep netting because there was so many other insects in there, lots of spiders, all sorts. And I think that might have been, if I'd have had more time, uh, that would have been a really interesting thing to look at, but maybe something that someone else can do at some point.
Yeah, great. Um, thanks for that. Tom, oh, he just moved. Well, he didn't move, but his message just moved up my screen. So sorry, I'll just find that. Tom asks, you mentioned that practices other than just grazing management may vary between the two management groups. Was mob grazing more associated with planting of herbal leys, for example, compared to single species leys for permanent pasture for set stocking? Sorry, did you gather that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so obviously the kind of pasture composition is going to be influenced by what the farmers choose to sow. So things like herbal leys, and so we did look at whether plant diversity and species richness were different between the two systems. They were not significantly different, but there was definitely a trend for there to be higher plant diversity and higher species richness in the mob graze fields compared with the set stock fields. In terms of permanent and permanent and temporary grassland, I didn't include this in the models, but what I did do is when I was pairing the mob graze fields with the set stock fields, if the mob graze field was permanent grassland, I made sure that the set stock field was also permanent pasture, and then same thing with like temporary grassland. Yes, I'm not sure if that answers the whole question. Uh,
It certainly addresses it. So thanks for that. Um, Gavin asks, what sort of success rate did you have with the rearing?
oh no, I was hoping no one would ask me this.
That's
Uh,
kind of thing that a lot of us get up to, in probably in much smaller, less stressful numbers than what you were trying to do, and with less
yeah.
riding on it normally as well.
Um, I have been too scared to actually look at what my percentage success rate was. So I can't tell you like percentage wise, but it was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. I was really pleasantly surprised actually with how little deaths I had. They were mostly, from parasites. That was, mostly the reason. I managed to avoid things like kind of fungal infections, which was what I was worried about in the plastic pots, but that it didn't seem to be an issue. Maybe because I just kept them in the shed outside. I don't know. Um, there were some species that were easier than others. I found particularly um, there were some species that I just had no success with, basically, and ended up just putting them as like a group, right? That's one of these two species, and just releasing them because they just weren't happy being held in captivity. But the rest were, yeah, it wasn't so bad.
Okay, great. There are still questions coming in. I'm mindful that we should move on probably, but so perhaps you could, if you're able to stay on a few minutes, Rochelle, or whether you're planning
Yeah,
on staying for the next talk anyway, perhaps
yeah, I
you
was going to
could
say,
respond to the any questions that we haven't addressed live. I
yeah,
don't want to leave anyone out, but
do that.
I'm mindful that we've got another talk to fit in as well, and then want to leave time for questions after that as well. But
Yeah,
thanks very much again. Really, really interesting work. Um, Ways more to do, isn't there? But as you say, it doesn't always have to be you. There are other scientists around to pick up the mantle and carry on. Andy's got his hand up. Is it a question, Andy, or is it something? Unmute yourself if you want to, if it's something vital. If it's just a question for Rochelle, please put it in the chat. Don't know. Go on. Um, okay, great. We will move on. So thanks again, Rochelle. We'll move on to the second and final talk for the evening. And this is also coming from Scotland. And this is Patrick Cook, a colleague of mine from Butterfly Conservation, who's going to again talk about moths and land use change, but this time talking about afforestation, more trees in the landscape, which is very topical. There are enormous targets by the various governments around the UK for increasing the number of trees, principally driven by trying to address the climate crisis, but obviously with big potential impacts on other things, including biodiversity and moths. So, Patrick, would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, okay, I'll share that. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Just share that. You could let me know if that's showing okay.
That looks great. Thanks very much. Okay, over to you,
I'll
Patrick.
go ahead then. So this evening, I'm going to give you an overview of the research project we have done looking at moths and woodland expansion in the uplands at a place called Mar Lodge Estate. So as Richard said, we're going to sort of touch upon these themes of upland management, sort of woodland expansion and so on, and then how the sort of moth communities are responding to some of these sort of habitat restoration methods. So the sort of system that I'm going to be talking to you about is the Caledonian pinewood this evening, but the sort of key results are relevant to you in your sort of upland areas in Dartmoor and Exmoor and so on as well. And I'll try and sort of make a few linkages between the two this evening for you. So this is the landscape that I'll be talking to you about this evening. So this is Mar Lodge Estate, which is right in the centre of the Cairngorms National Park. It's an absolutely stunning part of the UK and was an absolute pleasure to be moth trapping in. So really excited to be able to tell you about some of our findings from that this evening. So when we think about the uplands and what they look like from a moth perspective, generally most of our uplands across the UK look like the photo in the top left here. So dominated by heather moorland. As you go further west, often this turns into sort of more purple moorgrass dominated habitats, but usually managed for sort of 2 or 3 types of land use. So in this instance here, we can see all these sort of burnt patches upon the hill. So up in Scotland, moorlands often manage to produce high numbers of red grouse, which are then sort of commercial shooting. We also have often quite high numbers of red deer in the uplands. So over the last sort of 200 years, sporting estates have become more popular. And we see this sort of artificially inflated high numbers of deer. And that's something I'm going to talk about quite a bit throughout this evening's presentation. And the third thing, which is maybe a bit more relevant to what you have down in Dartmoor and Exmoor, and certainly as we head sort of further west in Scotland, is high numbers of livestock, so particularly sort of high sheep grazing densities. Also thinking about sort of the Welsh uplands as well in that particular example. Now, all of these sort of factors can reduce vegetation regenerating, particularly trees. But we're very lucky in Scotland in that we have quite a few sort of examples of what upland vegetation might have actually looked like, or could potentially look like in the future. So in the bottom right-hand picture here, I'm showing you a picture of Balchbuie pine woods. So this is my favorite place in the entire world. And what you can see is that we've got this nice mix of mature canopy levels of pine trees, good broadleaf elements with birch. We've got bits of sort of natural tree regeneration. But also importantly, we've got these sort of open areas within the woodland as well. So we've got a mix of heather, blaeberry, which I think you call bilberry, down in the southwest, and then sort of grading into the sort of higher ground on the hill as well. So what I was quite interested in is how sort of moth communities, numbers of species, the abundance of moths sort of differ between some of these habitats that we find in the uplands. So as Richard mentioned, there's a big push across the UK to expand woodland cover. This is primarily being achieved by tree planting, and particularly so in the uplands. So in Scotland, we have government targets that are trying to increase the amount of woodland cover by about 10,000 to 15,000 hectares a year. So this is equivalent to about 21,000 football pitches. Now, most of this woodland expansion is being achieved by planting in tree tubes, quite a sort of regular structure as well. And this is very different from achieving woodland expansion through natural regeneration, which is a lot more random, a lot more diverse in terms of structure as well. The other key problem for us, and probably the thing that we deal with most in the Scotland team with tree planting, is damage to sort of sensitive habitats. So things like species-rich grassland. So we're quite sort of advocates for natural tree regeneration when it comes to these types of sort of projects. What we have up here are quite a few emerging landscape scale natural regeneration projects, particularly in the uplands. So you might have heard of projects such as Cairngorms Connect or Mar Lodge, which I'm going to be talking about tonight. So these are these sort of woodland expansion projects at scale using natural tree regeneration. The way these estates have achieved this is by reducing red deer numbers to a level that allows natural regeneration to begin to get away. So as I mentioned earlier on, what we've had over the last 200 years with the development of sporting estates is very high densities of deer. This has prevented natural tree regeneration in a lot of our sort of pine woods and other sort of upland woodlands, such as birch woodlands, to the extent that we've had no regeneration in some of these for the last sort of 150, 200 years or so. So we're in a quite a sort of exciting time when it comes to our upland woodland habitats in Scotland. And one of these key habitat types are our native pine woods. So if you've not visited a native pine wood, this gives you an idea of what they look like. Very similar to the Balkbui pine wood. So this example is from a place called Glen Tanner. We can see we've got lots of mature pines here, but also this sort of really nice juniper understory mixed in with a few broadleaves. And this really sort of nice ground layer of heathers and bilberry and so on. Now, our native pine woods have been quite heavily fragmented, so just 84 fragments remain, which is about 1% of their former range. And there's an organisation called Trees for Life that published a report a couple of years ago on the status of these fragments. And they found about 23% of these are critically endangered. So we're not getting any tree regeneration occurring, primarily because of these high deer densities. A lot of the remaining trees are very old, struggling to produce seed. So we're not going to get this next generation and cohort, and therefore continuity of this habitat. Now, this is a particular problem in the west of Scotland, where we've got really high rainfall, and that rainfall is increasing, which means it's much harder to get this sort of tree regeneration going. So there's a growing interest in reducing deer numbers at a landscape scale, and these projects have really taken off in the central and eastern highlands. Now, where this is sort of relevant to you in the southwest of England is that there's a lot of sort of debate and discussions about sort of grazing levels in Dartmoor and so on. And what I'm hoping is that this will sort of show you what happens if we reduce sort of grazing levels and allow sort of trees to begin to regenerate a bit more naturally. So the place that we worked at is called Mar Lodge Estates. So this is the largest national nature reserve in the UK. So Mar Lodge is in the sort of eastern highlands. So it's just this dot here, which is bang in the middle of the Cairngorms National Park. So this is one of the most interesting and biodiverse areas that we have in the UK. It's got some really great remaining semi-natural habitat, both in terms of woodland, other sort of cool habitats like upland calcareous grassland. But what the Cairngorms is particularly well known for is its montane habitats. So this is sort of most sort of extensive high montane plateau anywhere in the UK. So lots of cool stuff like montane willows and so on occurring on the slopes of these hills. Mar Lodge also has 3 remaining fragments of Caledonian pinewood interspersed with sort of birch woodland as well. So this example here is in a glen called Glen Coich, which is a really cracking place to go and visit, and a very sort of mothy glen as well. So you've got lots of moths actually in the pinewood itself. And then when you go up on the tops of the hills, you can find some really interesting micro moths. So things like Catoptria furcatellis live on the top of this hill here, which is called Bane of Ed. So since the last sort of 20 years, the estate has been engaged in a wide-scale habitat restoration project. So this is looking to restore things like peatlands, expand the Caledonian pinewood cover. And after about 10 to 20 years, what we're seeing is we've got this emerging landscape where trees are beginning to naturally regenerate. The peatlands are being restored, as I said. And we're seeing these trees beginning to push up towards their more natural altitudinal limit. Now, one day I was sort of walking around Mar Lodge. You see all this sort of young woodlands beginning to emerge. And I was sitting there thinking, I wonder what's happening from a moth perspective as we sort of transition from, say, open areas of moorland to these developing woodlands, and then the actual sort of mature existing fragments of pinewood as well. So this is what we're sort of seeing at Mar Lodge. We've got some areas of the estate that are remaining as open treeless moorland. This is what a lot of the uplands sort of look like. But as we've reduced the deer numbers across the estate, we've got these sort of areas of early successional or young woodlands, or sort of regeneration areas, as I'll potentially call them tonight, where we have mainly pine regeneration coming through, but also lots of sort of birch and so on. And you can see this is quite a diverse mixed habitat. So we have different densities of trees. We still have open areas of moorland. And it's sort of quite varied, provides maybe a bit more shelter for moths and so on. And then we get into our sort of Caledonian pinewood fragments. So again, sort of really mature pines. We've got areas of sort of broadleaf trees. And then in some places, we get this really sort of cracking juniper understory coming in as well. So what we wanted to understand is how moths differ at Marl Lodge Estate between these 3 different habitat types. What are the sort of benefits to bringing in natural tree regeneration to the landscape? What are potentially some of the drawbacks? So do we begin to lose some of these sort of moorland associated species as well? And the key question we really wanted to look at is, what does each of these 3 habitat types bring to the landscape? So to do this, we set up 54 study points across Marl Lodge. So we set these up in 3 of the areas of mature woodland. So in Glen Louis / Glen Derry, which is over here. And we had plots in mature woodland and then the early successional woodland. And then in the zone of marsh forest, this is in Glen D, and then also in Glen Coich as well, which is on the eastern side of the estate. The areas of moorland are on the sort of southwest of the estate. So the reason for this is that the estate is separated effectively in 2. So we have the regeneration project zone on the north side of the River Dee, and on the south side, this is being maintained with a sporting interest. So this is part of the agreement of how National Trust for Scotland acquired the estate. So this means these plots on the south side are very representative of moorland that we have in wider Scotland, with typical deer densities. On the north side of the estate, a lot of the moorland at the altitudes we were interested in is beginning to sort of get tree cover going. In these photos, you can see some of the examples of the habitats we were trapping in. So our mature woodland areas here. We've then got these sort of young woodlands with this sort of light tree cover beginning to emerge over the last 10 to 20 years. And then our open areas of moorland here. So the moorland we've selected was quite sort of dry, heather moorland, rather than the really wet sort of purple moorgrass dominated type that we also get. So what we did was we compared the numbers of species. So we're going to call this species richness. We then looked at the abundance, so how many individual moths did we actually get? And then this thing called community composition as well. So just to make this a wee bit more sort of meaningful, if you've not come across the term community composition before, I use this sort of example of jelly beans. So in this example, we've got 2 different communities. What we're interested in when we're talking about community composition is the number of species. So that would be the number of different colors of jelly beans, but then also merging that together with the abundance of those species as well. So how many sort of green jelly beans do we see versus yellow jelly beans in this community on the left versus this community on the right? The final thing that we looked at, which I'm only going to touch upon slightly as we sort of go through these first 3 results, are also the sort of habitat features that moths are responding to. So the percentage of canopy cover, the amount of sort of natural tree regeneration, the cover of broadleaf trees versus conifer trees, these sorts of things are what we were sort of looking at. So to do this, at each of our 54 plots, we had 18 in each of the 3 habitat types. We ran moth traps at the end of June and the start of July over a 2-week period, and then again at the end of July and the beginning of August. So this meant over the course of the project, we ran a total of 108 light traps. So we were operating in quite remote areas. This was quite a logistic sort of nightmare to get our heads around getting up into some of these glens. We're sort of 5+ kilometers away from the nearest road into some of these sites, like this one on the right. Luckily, we had fantastic support from the National Trust for Scotland staff, but we also have really dedicated butterfly conservation volunteers in the local area. So these are really hardy folks that are quite happy to get up into the hills to help us sort of setting up the moth traps. So we selected this time range because it coincides with the sort of peak in moth numbers in this area. This is quite an upland habitat, so the altitude that we were trapping at was between 400 500 meters. If we went earlier than sort of late June, we're probably going to get quite a lot of zero counts because the nights are still pretty cold. Even when we were trapping at the end of July, the maximum overnight temperature we had was 13 degrees. So that's quite different from what you might sort of experience in Devon. We were really lucky though. We across the 4 weeks of trapping that we did in these habitats, we didn't have a single windy night, which for me, having done a lot of trapping in the uplands, is just unheard of. So that was a real positive. We used these low power 6-watt light traps, and the reason for that is that they're quite easy and relatively light to transport. This is quite hard habitat to walk across. You're sort of talking about heather that's sort of up to knee height in places to get through. The other reason we selected these lower powered traps is we really wanted to represent what moths were in that local habitat. So when you begin to use things like mercury vapor traps, whilst they're very effective in bringing in a lot of moth species, if you happen to hit quite a warm night where there's high moth activity, you can often start to record a lot of these moths that are sort of just passing through and maybe not necessarily so associated with that particular habitat type. So as you can imagine, after running sort of 108 light traps and getting up at before 4 a.m. Every morning and finishing work at sort of 10 p.m, you begin to go a bit stir crazy and look a bit like this at the end of the project. But it was absolutely fantastic. We had some really sort of cracking moths. We had this quite nice setup in the morning where we'd sort of run through all the moths in a sort of undercover location. The reason for that was if you were to identify out in the field when you're running through sort of 9 traps in one night, you would get absolutely roasted to death by midges. So bringing them back to a central location just makes it a wee bit easier, more comfortable to process and to charge the batteries and so on. Did begin to look a bit like a sort of entomological edition of Breaking Bad, though, with all this sort of equipment set up in this sort of location. So what did we find in terms of moths? So our two most common species across the habitat types were, unsurprisingly, true lover's knot and engrailed clay. But we also recorded quite a lot of northern associated species and upland associated species as well. So things like Scotch amulet were quite common in a lot of our moth traps, particularly in the sort of moorland zone where we begin to get a few sort of rocks and so on occurring in there. Things like dark tussock were picked up in decent numbers, as well as scarce silver wye. Grey mountain carpet was very common, and what might be surprising to you is you'd think we'd pick this up in its highest numbers in the moorland zone. We actually had the highest numbers of grey mountain carpet in the mature pine wood. So we began to pick up a few sort of ecological surprises like that. Things like heath rustic appeared in sort of 1s and 2s in places. And then we picked up a few sort of local specialities as well. So things like cousin German occurred in the sort of scrubby regeneration zone. And then one of my favourite local moths, which is a bit of a northeast Scotland speciality, So this is one of the Crambidae groups. This is Catoptria permutatalis. So this looks very similar to the more common and widespread Catoptria pinella, but it has this additional little white streak on the back. So when you see these in the real life, in the flesh, they've got this wonderful sort of orange sheen to the wing with these nice sort of white stripes occurring across the wing as well. We had a few other nice micros as well. So Denisia similella was another good one, which is associated with fungi. So we're finding that in the woodland zone. So total numbers of species, we recorded 117 species and just shy of 3,000 individual adult moths in total. So considering the altitude we are trapping at and the sort of light traps that we were using, I was really pleased with the numbers of moths that we recorded as the project. So moving on to the results, what differences did we find between these three habitat types? So between the moorland, the sort of regenerating young woodland, and then these mature pinewood remnants. So I've shown these as sort of box plots. If you've not seen box plots before, don't worry, I'm sort of just going to talk you through each step and explain it. So this middle line represents the sort of median of species richness that we expect in that particular habitat. And this shows the box width sort of shows roughly the sort of range that we would expect to see in that particular habitat. Each of these dots represents one of those 54 locations that we surveyed twice and shows the number of species recorded at each of those locations. So what we can see is that generally as we get more trees occurring in our upland landscapes, we get more moth species occurring as well. Now, when we tested this statistically, we didn't find a statistical difference between the moorland and the young woodlands in terms of the number of species, but we did find that the mature pinewood held higher numbers of species than the other two habitat types. Now, this isn't particularly surprising. This habitat is much more structurally diverse. It's got a greater sort of composition of different tree species, so pine, birch, there's a few sort of willows in there, which provides more diversity of food plants to build up our numbers of species as well. It's also a more sheltered habitat. So if you are a moth species that requires a bit of sort of shelter, that means you're more likely to be found in this mature woodland. So our key conclusion from this is that in our sort of upland landscapes, if we want to maximize the numbers of species, we need to have and to protect these mature pinewood fragments. And in the long term, we need to look to be able to expand these. So it's probably a 200-year time period to begin to develop these sort of mature pinewood characteristics. And that's what we should be aiming to sort of manage towards to boost species richness. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might be wondering what these three plots up here that have higher species richness than other areas. The reason for that was that these plots had slightly higher birch component to them. And birch is probably the most species-rich tree for moths in, particularly in northern Scotland, possibly more so than, say, oak and so on as well. So I appreciate down in sort of southern England, oak is the most important tree. But in Scotland, because of the amount of area that it covers, birch is this key sort of species of tree for us. Now, this is quite a neat result to be able to show with birch because we've lost a lot of the birch in the pine woods. And actually, birch is this key component. It fertilizes the soil, provides this sort of diversity of sort of broadleaf component, which is particularly important for moth species. By comparison, pine has a lot less sort of species associated with it. So quite a nice thing to be able to show to practitioners. We want to be able to encourage broadleaf regeneration in this, which is more possible if we reduce deer numbers. Now, historically, birch was reduced in this habitat as these woodlands were managed for timber. And also, as we saw the increase in deer numbers since the sort of 1800s in this habitat type, it meant that the broadleaf trees in particular struggled to regenerate. So what did we find in terms of abundance of the number of individuals? So what we found when we tested this statistically was that the young woodland supported higher abundance of moths than the moorland. And again, the mature woodland supported a higher abundance than both the young woodland and the moorland as well. So we see this sort of step change increase as we go through. So I think the key results here are that we're starting to see more shelter in this habitat, and that allows sort of quite high abundances of moths to be reached. I did also wonder, and I think this is a limitation of using light traps, is that in the sort of moorland, it's quite an exposed habitat type. So generally wind speeds will be slightly higher in this, and it probably makes the moth traps slightly less effective in terms of their ability to sort of actually capture the moths as well. I do generally think there is a sort of abundance effect though, despite that potential limitation. And again, we particularly see these high abundances in areas where we begin to see sort of these broadleaf components developing as part of our mature pine wood. What's also quite nice though is that even in these early successional woodlands that are semi-open, we see this sort of step up in abundance. Now, this is a key conservation message because this habitat type is largely missing from uplands, and these positive results can be found within sort of 10 to 20 years in this sort of example here. Now, often when we're sort of planting trees and trying to encourage woodlands, we do it in a bit of a rush, but using natural tree regeneration, and particularly in a Scottish landscape, these trees grow quite slowly. I think going slow is a really good thing from a habitat restoration perspective in this respect. We want to maintain some sort of semi-openness and diversity, and that's what this sort of habitat provides in the uplands here. So the final sort of result to go through was looking at community composition. So I do have a sort of chart that shows this, and I'm happy to sort of show that after the presentation. I've not put that in here because it's sometimes a little bit confusing for folks to sort of understand. But there were sort of several key findings that we had when we looked at this sort of assemblage of moths found across these three habitat types. So the first thing that we found was that there was sort of crossover in the assemblage between each tree. So they all shared sort of some species, but they also all supported a slightly different sort of assemblage of species as well. So all three habitat types bring something slightly different to this upland landscape. So the key message there is that we need each of these three habitat types. What we found is that the mature woodland and the young woodlands were more similar in terms of their community composition than they were to the sort of moorland zone. So when we look at that chart, what we found is that the moorland in particular had this sort of distinct assemblage of open ground species. So what we have to be very careful of when we sort of undertake these woodland expansion projects is that we don't end up with a situation that it's just wall-to-wall trees and woodland. It's absolutely critical that we retain some open areas of moorland. This would also apply to other habitat types as well. So if we were talking about upland calcareous grassland, it's really important that we retain those open areas because they have this distinct assemblage of moths. The other thing that we found that was very interesting was that these young woodlands supported a really diverse community. So these young woodlands encompassed much of the variation that we see in both the moorland zone and in the mature woodland. And that's because this habitat type is an intimate mix of areas of sort of open moorland, low density tree regeneration, and high density tree regeneration as well. So this provides a range of food plants, different niches for moth species to accumulate. And what we see side by side are moorland associated moths and tree associated moths as well. So this really nice, diverse sort of community. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, this habitat type is pretty much completely missing from our uplands. And particularly in Scotland, we have these sort of pine and birch woodlands that like to naturally regenerate into open areas. So they would have shifted their stances over time and space. And this habitat type would have been really common if we went back in time and looked at the sort of uplands. So by bringing this back, we can have these sorts of benefits occurring to moth species. The other cool thing that we found with this habitat type is a lot of the moorland associated species actually had higher abundance in this early successional habitat type. Now, I think this is a genuine sort of ecological effect occurring here. So when we look to similar examples in Norway and Scandinavia, a lot of the sort of upland habitats look quite similar to this. And I actually think quite a few of these moorland upland moths are quite well adapted to these sort of semi-open habitats. Obviously not all of them, and there is a trade-off. Some species sort of decrease in abundance as we get sort of tree cover. So wormwood pug would be an example of that. That had its highest abundance in the sort of moorland zone. And obviously there are other sort of moorland associated moths that fly earlier on in the year that we wouldn't have recorded that are very much associated with open conditions. So things like small dark yellow underwing and some of the other sort of berry associated moths. A really nice result anyway to be able to show to sort of land managers and practitioners. So just to sort of wrap up with, when we sort of see these woodland expansion projects using natural tree regeneration taking off in our uplands, we see this quite nice results in terms of species richness and abundance and diversifying our moth communities in the uplands. A key finding from our study is that we need to have all three land cover types. So the more different types of habitat that we have in the uplands, the better that is going to be for moth species. Mature woodland is particularly good for supporting high species richness and abundance. And in the long term, we need to protect and expand this habitat as a priority. But what we've also shown is that by allowing these young woodlands to develop in upland areas, creating these sort of scrubby, diverse habitats, we can achieve quite interesting results and a few ecological surprises for moths in a relatively short time period, over sort of 10, 20 years. We do also need to be mindful to not go for wall-to-wall trees though, and try to maintain some of these sort of open habitats as well. So we've shown this works in an upland sort of scenario in Scotland with a sort of forest type that's dominated by pine, which isn't the most sort of diverse species tree. And trying to sort of just link this to the sort of southwest uplands at the end, you know, I would expect that if we saw sort of similar examples of expanding some of this sort of oak woodlands, so thinking about places that I've heard of like Wistman's Wood, which just looks like the most sort of stunning sort of woodland, I imagine that the effect might be even sort of stronger, as there's a lot more sort of species associated with those sort of like broadleaf dominated woodlands. So the next sort of projects that we're beginning to think about is working in sort of broadleaf dominated woodlands in the uplands. We're talking to a few universities as well about comparing sort of tree planting sites and sort of naturally regenerating woodland sites as well. So those are going to be our next steps. We've just submitted the findings that we've got here as a scientific paper, and that's just going through review just now. So hopefully in a few months' time, we might have something published on that we can share with you as well. So that's everything I was going to go with tonight. I hope you found that interesting. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you've got now, or if anything popped into your head, feel free just to drop me an email afterwards as well. So I will stop sharing my screen just now, and then I'll take a look in the chat.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Patrick. That's great, and lovely to see the those stunning habitats and some exciting moths. I was sitting there going, "Yeah, I've not seen that, not seen that, not seen that." And I
That's how I feel when I see what everyone sees down in Devon.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, any questions for Patrick off the back of his talk? Please stick them in the chat. Okay. So the first one is in. So Rob asks, in explaining moth species richness and abundance, is it diversity of larval food plants which are the key factors, or changes in structural complexity? And how important
is it's a bit of both.
Yeah, sorry. And how important is the availability of nectar?
Okay. Yeah, so with the larval food plants, so I think that is a key thing. So when we get into, say, the mature pinewood, as I mentioned, there's this sort of broadleaf component. So birch, you've got the pine, which you don't get in the sort of just open moorland zone. The other thing you see in the mature pinewoods is that the sort of ground layer transitions from being what is heather dominated to being blaeberry. I think you call it bilberry further south, being more sort of blaeberry dominated. So blaeberry supports a much higher number of moth species than heather. Both plants are really good, but when we sort of get that sort of blaeberry zone coming through, I think that has an important effect on moths. And blaeberry is much more common in the woodlands than it is out on the sort of open moorland zone. In terms of the structural complexity, I do think that is quite a key thing. So one of the habitat features we actually measured was the vertical structural complexity. So what that is basically a score looking at the amount of canopy cover of trees, the amount of sort of developing tree regeneration, and the amount of cover of woody shrubs in the understory as well. And we found quite a lot of moth groups had a positive association with those various factors. We've also done other sort of research into sort of forestry and found that often this sort of structural complexity is very important from a moth perspective. I think shelter is probably the key factor associated with that, particularly in these sort of really windy, exposed habitats. With regards to sort of nectar sources, it's maybe a bit harder to pinpoint that. There has been some studies done on sort of pollinator use of nectar sources in the pinewoods. They're relatively limited in terms of their sort of floral diversity. So the main two nectar sources would be things like heather and particularly blaeberry. You also get some of the sort of other ericaceous shrubs, so like cowberry and so on, can be quite important. So my hunch would be that there's probably not a huge difference. You know, there's such a wide and huge amount of sort of heather on the hill when we get into the uplands that it's maybe not such a critical factor in terms of influencing those trends that we've documented in our study.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrick. Paul asks whether you looked at any day-flying species as part of the study.
No, so we did consider it, but because of the remoteness of the habitat, very tricky to get out to some of these sites and to get around enough of the sites. And also the other factor is just getting the right sort of weather. You just get very short weather windows, whether that's sort of sunshine hours or sort of like wind speeds and things like that. It would just make it logistically very difficult to get around all of them. Where it would be quite interesting is a lot of the moorland species can fly sometimes in quite high numbers during the day or at dusk. So things like grey mountain carpet, often if you go out at sort of dusk and so on, will be in quite high numbers. So it's just one of those sort of limitations and just really a feasibility thing why we didn't know about that.
Yeah. Okay, great. I was going to ask you about deer. Obviously, you talked about deer a bit, and presumably all of these targets around, woodland expansion, whether it's planted or whether it's through natural regeneration, is all completely dependent on deer control and that sort of side of things. So is that is that all kind of properly factored in? Are these woodland targets realistic, bearing that in mind, or is it all a bit pie in the sky because there are always going to be far too many deer to get this kind of woodland re-established?
Yeah, so I think if we're looking at it from trying to achieve it through natural regeneration, we would have to reduce our deer densities with the way things are. I personally think it's one of the biggest factors we have in Scotland for limiting the potential of biodiversity that we have as an overabundance of deer. So I do quite a lot of work on upland species, and there's quite a few of them. There's one that I work on that feeds on montane willows. That's completely restricted by sort of overabundance of deer. I think meeting the targets is, I think they're probably not meeting their targets through tree planting. It's just very difficult to achieve it that way. Whenever you do plant trees, though, a deer fence is always put around them. That comes at a massive cost. They are usually only effective for about 20, 30 years. When we get the snows in the winter, often the fences are breached and the deer will get in, ruin all that regeneration that you might get. So it's really not a viable long-term solution, I don't feel. And it doesn't solve the underlying sort of issue. There are landscapes where sporting states will always have high numbers of deer, so that's the only way you can really work. The thing I really like about once we reduce the deer numbers, it's not about eradicating deer. They're still a really important part of these woodland ecosystems, and it's key we still have them in there. But once you get that natural regeneration going in a landscape, it's sort of like this cyclical effect. There's that once you get some trees coming in, they begin to seed, you then get more going, and then it sort of expands. It's not quite the same if you plant trees inside a deer fence and you've still got high numbers of deer. It's always just going to be quite a sort of binary, here we have trees, here we don't. That's not to say that tree planting, if done sensitively, can't be very effective, though. So there's some really great examples in southern Scotland. Carafran wildwood is a really good example. It's had very positive effects for biodiversity. But often when we're meeting those targets, it's not done in that way. And that's the key issue, is the sensitivity of it, really.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, there aren't any other questions. So, and it's 9 o'clock now. So I think that's oh, no, there is one. Sorry, one just come in at the very last moment. So it's Rob again. On Dartmoor, there's great concern over the perceived spread of malinia. Has any research been done on the impact of this in moths that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of any specifically on it. What we did find in our study, so we recorded the percentage sort of grass cover all sort of lumped together. We didn't identify the grass as two species, but it was dominated by purple moorgrass. And we did find a negative trend across a lot of groups in terms of species richness and abundance, with increasing cover of grasses. Whereas we found the opposite when you've got sort of cover of blaeberry and heathers and so on. So I suspect there's a negative effect there. I think that's probably because Millennia will sort of just dominate the area. It becomes a bit of a monoculture, and it doesn't really support that many moth species either, in comparison to, say, the sort of ericaceous shrubs and so on. So it's still, important to have bits of Millennia, but yeah, I think when we go to those sort of Millennia dominated habitats, you do probably lose diversity. But it is something that would need a bit more research. We've only sort of very lightly touched upon that in our study.
Great. Well, we will draw it to a close there then. And I'll just thank Patrick again and Rochelle for really interesting talks. And thank you both for giving up your time to join us from afar. Much appreciated. And thanks very much to everyone for joining the meeting this evening. Good to see a good number of members here. I'm going to stop the recording while I remember to.